buongiorno.
Mi dà una guida di Isernia,
Sì.
per favore?
Ma lei è Giulia Pardi?
Sì, sì.
Complimenti signora per i suoi viaggi.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Arrivederci.
Thank you.
The Paleolithic site in Isernia was discovered in 1978 during roadworks. The excavations, which are still underway, unearthed a series of complex stratifications. These helped in the reconstruction of the evolution of geological events, which together with the alternating sediments from volcanoes, rivers and lakes, brought to light the past history of the site and helped date the presence of prehistoric man to 700,000 years ago. These rich archaeological findings, both lithic and paleontological, stone and bone, reveal what has been preserved over the years in this low-lying area. The stone relics are spread over 4 surfaces and grouped according to their various characteristics. The primitive weapons are obviously man-made and were probably beaten into shape on some kind of anvil with a primitive hammer. Their purpose was for the hunting and slaughter of animals, as can be seen from their cutting edge. From the bone fragments, it can be deduced that large animals such as bison, great pachyderms, deer and bears were the main prey. Also, the presence or absence of various parts of anatomy gives some insight as to whether the whole carcass was transported to the site or just bits of it. This also reveals a modus operandum of how the Homo erectus survived. From a study of bone surfaces under the microscope, it can be seen how the stone tool was used to cut the meat. The Paleolithic settlement in Isernia is renowned all over Europe for the richness of its treasures, which include tools, bone fragments and animal carcasses. It is also considered one of the most important sites of a first settlement on the continent. Originally, the pavilion served to protect the surfaces of the excavations, but it also houses an information centre and a laboratory where close check is kept on the survey and measurements of new digs. All is kept scrupulously up to date. It constitutes the first step in an ample archaeological complex which will eventually embrace the Paleolithic Museum. This settlement in Isernia, unique in its kind, forms part of various discoveries in different areas of the region of man's artefacts during the Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic periods. The city of Isernia, situated between 2 valleys marked by the rivers Carpino and Sordo, was originally settled by the Samnites. Many centuries ago, at the beginning of time, there lived in the heart of Italy the Sabine people. They celebrated the Ver Sacrum at the beginning of spring to ward off famine. All the newborn infants were sacrificed to the natural divinities. With time, the sages decided that instead of sacrificing the babies, a class of youths would abandon the villages during the sacred spring to colonize other lands. The youths, these founders of new colonies, were given a sacred animal to guide them through their journey. And so, one day, 7,000 Sabines trustfully followed their sacred ox, which brought them to the land of the Opici. After a long journey, the ox came to a stand in a narrow valley at the foot of snow-clad mountains. Following the sages' recommendations, the youths sacrificed the animal to the god Mamers. Mamers was the god of war, but he also presided over the springtime, because the season of wars began when the snow started to melt. There, after defeating the Opici, they founded their first city, which they called Bovianum, in honor of the sacred ox. These youths were called Sabelli, which means little Sabines. The name Sabelli changed into Samnites and gave the name to their grand civilization. Hello there, hello there. Who are you? Who are you? Do I have to speak in English, of course? Hello there. Where are you from? Are you an ancient Samnite? Are you an ancient Samnite dog? Yes. The Samnite Museum in Campobasso is to be found inside the Palazzo Mazzarotta, in the centre of the old town. The objects gathered from the area date from prehistoric times to the Samnite period and are displayed in 4 thematic sections. The ancient populace of the Samnites was mainly formed by 4 tribes: the Caraceni, Pentri, Caudini and Eupini, and similar peoples such as the Frentani. Linguistically, the Samnites belong to the Oscan group, which was part of the Osco-Umbrian family, including the Campani, Lucani and Bruzzi. Their alphabet consisted of 21 letters, one more than that used by the Etruscans. It was widely used in Molise, and the longest surviving document in this language is the Tavola di Agnone, the Agnone tablet, which is at present housed in the British Museum. It comes from the sacred ground dedicated to the goddess Ceres in Capricotta. It is a small bronze plate which refers to religious rites and altars dedicated to the divinities of the Samnite pantheon, the most important being the divinity Ceres. The Samnites are often remembered in classical sources for the canny determination they displayed in their heroic struggle against the Romans, in a period when the Roman Republic was intent on expanding its territory. The Samnites fought valiantly, but were overwhelmed. The Samnite Wars are copiously described by the renowned Roman historian Livy. Gavio Poncio Telesino went down in Samnite history as the hero who cleverly ambushed and defeated an army of 15,000 Roman soldiers. The event, which took place in 321 BC during the Second Samnite War, remains branded in the memory even today and is referred to as the Battle of the Caudine Forks, or the day the Romans had to eat humble pie. The Samnites ate and dressed simply, cultivating the ground and making metal ornaments. Initially, they didn't use coins, but bought and sold by barter. Due to the nature of the ground, their livelihood mainly came from sheep grazing and hunting. The former gave rise to the transhumance of sheep and the development of the tratturi, or sheep tracks. These sheep tracks were natural pathways which were beaten by men, sheep, and oxen. They have been used since time immemorial. Thousands of years of constant migration have marked passageways which can be easily recognized even today in central and southern Italy. These sheep tracks eventually gave way to roads and highways linking areas of commerce. They were well serviced both for men and beasts. In the 4th century before Christ, the Samnites built and fortified centres along the paths cut out by the sheep tracks. In Molise, for example, 70 centres were established over the centuries, among them Bovianum and Sepinum. From 343 to 290, the Samnites confronted the Romans in the 3 wars known as the Samnite Wars, which took place on many fronts. In particular, the 3rd war in 295 also involved the Etruscans, the Umbrians and the Gauls. It was after being defeated at this battle that the Samnites had to concede part of their territory to the Romans, the most fertile part. During the course of time, the Samnites infiltrated into the Roman social structure, but only in minor positions. In 263 BC, after the exhausting victory of the Romans over the Samnites, Isernia became a Latin colony. Signs can still be seen of 3rd, 2nd century structures, particularly in the walls of the courtyard of Santa Maria delle Monache. During the Social War, the Italici took over the city and made it their headquarters. Sylla reduced it to a mass of rubble, but Isernia was reconstructed and raised to the level of municipium and achieved new glory and splendour under Caesar and Augustus. The cathedral was built on the ruins of the temple of the Latin colony in the 3rd century BC. The excavations have brought to light signs of other important buildings in this sacred area. The Santa Maria delle Monache Museum contains a collection of funeral reliefs and tombstones bearing inscriptions. They come from Isernia and its surrounding territory. The funeral reliefs and honours show battle scenes, encounters with gladiators, and depict scenes from mythology with their friezes decorated with patterns of plants and fantastic animals. These bear witness to an active local craftsmanship developed during the late Republican and early Imperial period. Also on show in the museum are the archaeological findings from Roman necropolises, dating back to the occupation by the Samnites at the beginning of the 3rd century BC. These were discovered on one of the main roads leading out of the city in the district Quadrella. The Samnites buried their dead in tombs in a pit or under a mound with the objects they cherished in life. During the funeral rites, martial arts were celebrated. The Samnite gladiators were highly appreciated during the Roman period, and possibly the Romans inherited the art from the Samnites. For the Samnites, woods, water springs, fountains and caves were also places of worship. In ancient times, temples and sacred sites sprang up all over the area. The priests practiced witchcraft and occult sciences, as well as celebrating holy rites to guard the sanctuaries. The Samnites, in common with all the ancient Italic population, set great store on omens and the foretelling of the future. The Samnite divinities were above all linked to nature. In the local Samnite museum in Campobasso, the goddess with a polos on her head and a pomegranate in her hand is generally purported to be Demeter or Persephone. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter and Zeus, was kidnapped by her uncle Hades. He fell in love and abducted her, while she was gathering some flowers in the plains of Enna in Sicily with some nymphs. An angry Demeter abandoned the Olympus and wandered the earth in search of her daughter under the guise of an old woman. Her exile produced barrenness, and the order of the world was disrupted, so much so that Zeus commanded his brother Hades to return the daughter to the mother. But this was not possible, because the girl had eaten a pomegranate seed which tied her to Hades forever. And so it was decided that the girl would spend her time partly in the underworld and partly on earth. When she departed the underworld, spring blossomed, whereas during her reign in the underworld, the land became barren and winter set in. Venus was represented at the side of Priapus. Priapus, the god of the Asian city Lampsacus and the son of Aphrodite, was the protector of horticulture and viticulture. His impressive sexual organ had the power of undoing evil spells and of cancelling the malefic influences of those who wanted the ruin of the harvests. As an Asian god and the god of fertility, he was included in the followers of Dionysus. Places of worship were also places where politics were conducted even by members of the priesthood. In the sanctuary of Pietrabondante, a diagram of the temple cum auditorium clearly indicates the double functions of council meetings and senate assemblies. In temples such as this, fortunes of war were left at the altar, together with the votive offerings of the soldiers with regard to tasks to be taken on or in thanks for their fortunate escapes. It is not by chance, therefore, that weapons and pieces of armour have been found on the premises. After the war between Scylla and Mario, and the defeat of the latter, the sanctuary passed to the hands of the Socelli family, the remains of whose funeral monument have been found on the premises. The sanctuary soon fell into disuse, as religious ceremonies were no longer practiced there. However, it was not sacked or destroyed, but gradually abandoned. The Socelli family came from Terventum. Old Terventum, or Terraventum, of the Pentri Samnites became a Roman municipality in the middle of the 1st century BC. In the 4th century AD, an early Christian church was built in the historic centre on the site of a Roman temple dedicated to the goddess Diana. Two of the surviving buildings, which bear witness to the original Samnite settlement, can be seen on the right of the River Trigno. The rural villas are described in ancient manuscripts and were part of an agricultural industry which exploited the ground in medium-large dimensions to produce oil and wine for commerce. Water was an indispensable element for the work, so houses were constructed near rivers or springs. The Villa Canneto, for example, was built at the foot of a hill, and the water had to be channeled underground using pipes of terracotta. In the Pars Urbana, multicolored mosaics can be seen on the floors of 3 rooms. The part of the villa intended for the owner had to follow the criteria of voluptas, luxuria, delectatio, required of a country house. The superior mosaics are attributed to the 3rd century AD. The finest mosaic floors found in the area are from the period between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century AD and were discovered in Larino. They give some idea of the development of mosaic technique over the centuries, as well as the artistic tastes of the upper middle class from the 3rd century BC. The mosaic pavements of the ducal palace are unique of their kind. The most famous one is known as the Lupercale, which shows Romulus and Remus being suckled by the she-wolf. From a mountain crag, 2 shepherds are observing the scene. Another has a lion as the central figure, surrounded by complex geometric designs. The third, featuring birds, is incomplete, but probably decorated a triclinium. It is a multicolored design of lush vegetation and intertwined trees with birds on their branches. Situated on top of the western hills that overlook the plain and the Adriatic coast, Larino evolved over thousands of years and was highly frequented due to the fact it was adjacent to both coastal and inland roads. The most ancient references can be traced back to Neolithic times and continued through the Bronze Age and for the first part of the Iron Age. Already from the 5th century BC, people from the overpopulated villages or settlements began to gather together and look for new territory to build a town. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, it became a Roman municipality under Cicero and was renowned for its beautiful mosaics. The amphitheatre was built around 80 AD, thanks to a local senator who left provisions in his will. Venafrum, the ancient city of Oscan origin, was transformed during the Roman period when it became a colony in 49 BC. The Venus of Venafro, 2nd century AD, was discovered near the amphitheatre. It is similar in style to the Landolina Venus, which was modelled after the Venus of Cnido, a famous work of ancient times sculptured by Praxiteles. It probably came from an ornamental garden fountain, as can be seen from the dolphin, which was obviously designed to spurt water from its mouth. The remains of houses with mosaic pavings and frescoes were discovered in Via Carmine. Much of the pavement and tiling and signs of rich decorations still remain. Unfortunately, most of it is badly damaged. In common with other Roman cities, the necropolises of Venafrum were built along the main roads leading out of the city. Some of the remains from these necropolises are preserved in the Archaeological Museum of Venafro, which was formerly the convent of Santa Chiara. The museum also houses the tablet with inscribed the edict on the use of aqueducts. Augustus had the aqueduct built using water drawn from the source of the Volturno River. As the emperor often pointed out in his memoirs, he paid special attention to the well-being of his colonies. The aqueduct stretched for nearly 30 kilometers from the Volturno riverhead following the winding course of the river. It was of cement construction with brick paving and rounded arches. Various boundary stones have been found stipulating that an 8-foot passageway should be left on each side of the aqueduct. These passages were intended for servicing the aqueduct, something which was explicitly stated in the building regulations. In the 1st century BC, following the Social War, the Samnite territory was divided into municipalities, according to the practice favoured by the Romans. However, whereas Venafro was given the title of municipium, other places like Monte Vairano were completely abandoned. Monte Vairano, just outside Campobasso, preserves signs of the Samnite settlement which reached its zenith between the 4th and 2nd centuries BC. The oppidum of Monte Vairano consisted of a boundary wall with 2 flights of steps, 3 entry gates and a series of wooden towers. The Cyclopean wall wound for 2,900 meters around 3 hills and was made up of huge overlapping polygonal blocks. The reason the area became so populated is due to its strategic position. In fact, it was near 2 of the most important tratturi, the sheep tracks, of central Italy, the Pescasseroli to Candela and the Lucera to Castel di Sangro. Boiano and Cepino also knew development and fame thanks to their strategic position. Bovianum, headquarters of the Pentri tribe, overlooked the plain and controlled the natural roads of communication of the area. Traces of the old Cyclopean wall from Samnite times still remain near Larghetto Gentile, whereas the town today follows the same right-angled pattern of Roman dwellings. The settlement grew slowly alongside the road frequented by herds of sheep and cattle, and eventually gave the name to Bovianum, which functioned as a bull market. The public garden of Villeta is a kind of open-air antiquarium and contains a collection of funeral memorials and fragments of architectural remains from Roman times. The Acropolis was situated high on the Civita hill, and the dwellings were situated below, where a road crossed the village. The name Cepinum has its origin in the Latin cepio, enclosure, and probably indicates an enclosed area on an open plain. The Roman town developed where the Pescaceroli Candela sheep track intersected with the mule track descending from the Matese mountains, possibly towards the Adriatic coast. But the origins of Cepino go even further back, to the times of the Samnites and to Terra Vecchia, where there was a hill fort. The remains of a wall built with polygonal bricks has been found there. It was besieged by the Romans in 293 BC, and subsequently a new town developed in the valley alongside a sheep track, and on the site of a rural settlement which went by the name of Cepinum. In time, the square became a sort of spectacular open-air museum. It was full of statues of the emperors and members of the imperial families, and statues of the magistrates and illustrious and worthy people of Sapinum, such as Orazio Prisco, to whom an arch was dedicated at the beginning of the 2nd century AD. In the age of Augustus, when interest was burgeoning in building and administration, Sapinum became a municipality and one of the main headquarters of the 4th Augustan region. The city wall, built in a quadrangle, was strengthened by circular towers and accessed by 4 doors or gates. The theatre was built behind the city wall in the northern sector of the city. Some rural buildings were built on the site of the theatre. The Forum was the centre of public relations and communal activity, and acted not only as a meeting place par excellence, but was also the hub of legislative, judicial and local administration. Spread over various parts of the city, we find fountains and wash places fed by a network of water systems branching off in different directions and connected also to a sewage system. Parts of the water pipes are on show in the display case in the centre of the Archaeological Museum. In the same museum are remnants discovered in the necropolis which bear witness to the various aspects of urban life. Town planning remained vital at least until the 4th and 5th centuries AD, thanks to the assiduous and solicitous interventions of citizens and local magistrates. The disastrous earthquake of 346 AD, which struck the Sannio and Campania regions, marked the beginning of the end of the Roman world and cleared the way for the eventual birth of the Middle Ages. The fall of the great Roman Empire inevitably led to the decline of its cities. Sepinum suffered grave demographic and economic consequences. The wall collapsed in many places and in huge chunks. The population fled to the Matese Mountains. Following the fall of the Roman Empire, Isernia suffered a fate similar to other cities, and in 456 was destroyed by the barbarians, and in the 9th century was invaded by the Saracens. The beautiful and monumental construction of Santa Maria delle Monache was built at the height of the Middle Ages during the subsequent Lombard dominion and was restored by Landonolfo, the Count of Isernia, around the year 1000. The historic events concerning these people of Nordic origin, who dominated Italy for over 2 centuries, from 568 to 774, have been told by the Lombard historian Paolo Diacono in his work Historia Langobardorum. When Gisulfo I became Duke of Benevento, he changed the political order of the upper Volturno Valley, which was immediately behind the new frontier with the Byzantine Dukedom of Rome and the Lombard Dukedom of Spoleto. The foundation of a local monastery would guarantee stability in the area. The monastery of San Vincenzo in Volturno was founded at the very beginning of the 8th century by 3 nobles, Paldo, Taso and Tato, who had left their native city of Benevento in search of the ascetic life. They decided to establish their community on the banks of the Volturno River, on the site of an oratory dedicated to Saint Vincent. According to tradition, the oratory was built at the express wish of the Emperor Constantine, who passed by on his way to the Orient to found Constantinople. The Chronicon Vulturnense is an illustrated manuscript tracing the history of the monastery since its conception. It was compiled by a monk named Giovanni in 1130. Thanks to the founder's reputation for holiness, the number of monks increased rapidly, so that Abbot Paldo had to renounce his vows of poverty in order to accept donations for the upkeep of his thriving community of monks. In 774, the monastery passed under the control of Charlemagne and received particular attention from the emperor due to its strategic place at the southernmost limits of his empire. earthquake of 848 seriously damaged the monastery, and in 881 it was burnt to the ground by Arab warriors. Later it was rebuilt, but it never enjoyed the fame or prosperity it had known in the Lombard Carolingian period. Here, in this soil, rest the valiant knights, buried beside their noble war horses.